The moment Daniel placed the steaming cup of coffee in front of me, something felt off. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but after 6 years of marriage I knew when something wasn't right. I glanced at the cup, then at my husband. He was standing by the kitchen counter, casually sipping from his own mug, his expression neutral. Too neutral. His gaze flicked to mine for a fraction of a second before settling on something else. The clock, the window, anything but my eyes. I reached for the coffee, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic, inhaling deeply. The aroma was rich, dark, familiar. But underneath it was something else. Faint, almost hidden, but there. A bitterness that didn't belong. A scent that felt metallic, chemical, unnatural. I hesitated. Daniel never made my coffee. Not once in all our years together. It was always me who prepared the morning brew, always me who measured the grounds just right, who frothed the milk, who added just the right amount of sugar. He never cared for the process, never showed the slightest interest. So why now? I forced a smile, looking up at him. This is sweet of you. His lips curled into a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. You work hard. I thought I'd do something nice. Something inside me tightened. It was too smooth, too practiced. The way he said it, like he had rehearsed it beforehand. I looked back down at the coffee. I could just take a sip. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was a different brand, a different roast. Maybe I was being ridiculous. But my instincts screamed at me. So, instead of drinking, I shifted slightly, reaching toward his cup instead of mine. I did it casually, naturally, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. His fingers tightened around his mug. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker of tension. But I saw it. I lifted his cup to my lips, watching him carefully. His body stiffened, his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was perfect. Smooth, strong, with the exact balance of cream and sugar I liked. No bitterness. No strange aftertaste. And in that moment I knew. The problem wasn't with the coffee. The problem was with my cup. I set his mug down with a soft clink against the table and smiled at him again. You always know exactly what I like. His shoulders relaxed just a little, but I didn't miss the way he exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. I wrapped my fingers around my own cup, lifting it slightly, pretending to consider taking a sip. His eyes followed the motion, his fingers still gripping his own mug too tightly. I lowered it again without drinking. Maybe I'll wait a little, I said, tilting my head. It's too hot. Daniel's smile didn't waver, but something in his posture shifted. He hadn't expected that. And now I knew for certain. Something was very, very wrong. Daniel didn't move right away. He stood there, mug in hand, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't disappointment, not yet. He was waiting. Calculating. I lowered my cup back to the table, fingers resting lightly against the ceramic. The warmth seeped into my skin, familiar and comforting. I let my gaze drift toward the window, acting as if I wasn't studying him from the corner of my eye. He took a sip of his own coffee without hesitation. A long, deliberate drink. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. I mimicked his movements, lifting my cup again, tilting it ever so slightly toward my lips. He tensed. It was subtle, just a flicker of movement in his shoulders, a tightening around his mouth, but I caught it. I stopped short of drinking and set the cup down again, this time with a quiet, thoughtful hum. You know, I said, tapping my fingers lightly against the ceramic, I don't think I'm in the mood for coffee after all. He hesitated. Just for a second. Then he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Since when do you skip your morning coffee? I shrugged. I don't know. I just feel off today. It was a test. A careful, calculated statement designed to measure his reaction. And I wasn't disappointed. His expression remained neutral, but there was something else now. Something just beneath the surface. His fingers tapped once, twice against his mug. A nervous habit? A sign of frustration? Or something more? I stood up from the table, stretching my arms over my head like I was just waking up, then walked toward the sink, cup in hand. I felt his eyes on me with every step. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run, then slowly tipped my mug forward, pouring the coffee down the drain. The dark liquid swirled before disappearing, the scent of it rising in the air. Daniel inhaled sharply. I pretended not to notice. Instead, I rinsed the cup, placing it upside down on the drying rack. When I turned back, he was staring at me, expression carefully unreadable. You really didn't want it? He asked. I leaned against the counter, tilting my head. Why does it matter? For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Annoyance? Frustration? He covered it quickly, but not quickly enough. I just thought you'd like it, he said, forcing a smile. I wanted to do something nice for you. I held his gaze, silent, letting the tension stretch, letting him feel it. Then finally I smiled back. That's sweet of you. His shoulders relaxed. Just a little. He thought the moment had passed. That was his second mistake. The first had been underestimating me. Daniel's routine never changed. That was something I had always found comforting about him in the early years of our marriage. His predictability. He woke up at the same time every morning, made his coffee exactly the way he liked it, left for work without rushing, and always took his lunch break at noon. But now that predictability was a weapon. His own movements betrayed him, gave him away, exposed the widening cracks in the facade he had so carefully built. Because today he wasn't following his routine. After I had poured my coffee down the drain, Daniel lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. He pretended to be checking his phone, scrolling through messages that probably weren't there, his jaw tight. I could feel him watching me as I rinsed my hands under the faucet, the sound of the running water filling the space between us. He was waiting for something. I reached for a dish towel, drying my fingers slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch. Then I turned back to him, feigning curiosity. Aren't you going to be late for work? His hand tensed around his phone. Just slightly. He covered it quickly with a forced chuckle. I've got time. I glanced at the clock. 7:45 a.m. He usually left by 7:30 sharp. He was stalling. The realization sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to stay relaxed, to move as if nothing had changed. I leaned against the counter, tilting my head. So, what's on your schedule today? A simple, harmless question. One I had asked him 100 times before. Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Meetings, he said vaguely, shoving his phone into his pocket. Nothing exciting. Why? His tells were small, but I knew them all. The slight shift of his weight from one foot to the other. The way his fingers tapped against his thigh. The way his eyes flicked to the side before meeting mine again. I stepped forward just a little, testing the space between us. You seem tense. Daniel let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. I just didn't sleep well. Another lie. He had slept fine. I had lain awake for hours, thinking, planning, waiting for confirmation of what my gut had already told me. But Daniel, he had fallen asleep within minutes, his breathing deep and steady, without a single toss or turn. He was lying because he didn't know what I knew. Because he still believed he was the one in control. I gave him a small smile, placing a hand on his arm. You should get going, I said softly. I'll see you tonight. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Hesitation. Conflict. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but then thought better of it. Instead, he just nodded, squeezing my hand gently before stepping away. I'll text you later, he said. He picked up his briefcase, grabbed his keys from the counter, and walked out the door. I waited until I heard the sound of his car starting. Waited until I saw the taillights disappear down the street. Then I moved. Quick, precise. I grabbed a pair of gloves from under the sink, slid them on, and picked up his coffee cup from the table. It was still half full. Carefully, I carried it to the sink, reached into the drawer, and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. I tipped the cup, letting the remaining liquid drain inside before sealing it shut. My heartbeat was steady. My hands didn't shake. Because now I had proof. And Daniel had no idea what was coming. I placed the sealed bag inside a small box and tucked it beneath the false bottom of my desk drawer. My movements were careful, unhurried. Every action had to feel intentional, as if I had rehearsed it 100 times in my head. Which, in a way, I had. I glanced at the clock. 8:02 a.m. Daniel would be at least 15 minutes into his drive by now. He had a set route, barely deviating from it. That was another thing about him, he never changed course unless something forced him to. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping at one I hadn't dialed in years. My fingers hovered over the screen for only a second before I pressed call. 3 rings, then a familiar voice. Dr. Myers. Hi, it's me, I said. I need a favor. There was a slight pause. Then, I figured this day would come eventually. Dr. Evelyn Myers had been one of my closest friends in college before she became one of the best toxicologists in the state. We had drifted over the years, different lives, different careers, but some connections never really faded. She didn't ask why I was calling. He didn't need to. "Where do you want to meet?" she asked. I glanced at the bag hidden beneath the desk drawer. "Somewhere quiet. Usual spot. Give me an hour." I hung up without another word. I had always known that if I ever found myself in a situation like this, Evelyn would be the first person I called. She had a sharp mind, a keen sense of justice, and a way of reading people that was almost unnerving. If anyone could tell me what was in that coffee, it was her. I moved through the house, going about my routine as if it were any other day. I made the bed, loaded the dishwasher, wiped down the counters. The ordinary motions of a wife whose husband had just left for work. A woman with nothing to hide. But inside I was counting down the minutes. At exactly 9:15 a.m. I grabbed my purse, slipped the evidence bag inside and walked out the door. The drive to Evelyn's lab was smooth, uneventful. I knew this route well, even though I hadn't taken it in years. The research facility where she worked was tucked away in a quiet industrial district, away from prying eyes. When I arrived, Evelyn was already waiting outside, leaning against the hood of her car. She hadn't changed much. Her dark hair was still pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her expression sharp and unreadable. She didn't say anything at first, just held out her hand. I pulled the evidence bag from my purse and placed it in her palm. Evelyn turned it over, inspecting the liquid inside with a practiced eye. "How long ago?" "Less than 3 hours." She nodded, slipping the bag into a black case at her side. "I'll run a full analysis. Could take a few hours." "I can wait." She looked at me, then really looked at me, and something in her gaze softened. "Claire," she said quietly. "Are you in danger?" I exhaled slowly. "Not anymore." Evelyn didn't push for more. He never did. She just nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the lab, the door clicking shut behind her. I sat in my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the entrance she had just walked through. The next few hours would tell me everything. But deep down I already knew. Daniel had wanted me dead. And soon I would have proof. I spent the next few hours waiting in the only way I knew how, by keeping my hands busy. I didn't go home. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I drove to a small cafe a few blocks from Evelyn's lab, the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one lingered too long. I ordered a coffee not because I wanted it, but because holding something warm in my hands gave me an excuse to sit still. The minutes passed slowly. Too slowly. I stared at my phone, willing it to light up with a message, a call, anything from Evelyn. But the screen remained dark, mocking my patience. Outside, rain had begun to fall, light at first, then heavier, tapping softly against the cafe window. I watched the droplets slide down the glass, tracing invisible paths, trying to focus on anything but the reality of what I already knew to be true. Daniel had put something in my coffee. That fact was no longer in question. The only thing I didn't know was what. At exactly 1:42 p.m., my phone vibrated. "Evelyn." I answered before the first ring even finished. "Tell me." "Meet me back at the lab," she said. Now. That was all I needed to hear. I was out of my seat in seconds, weaving through the tables, tossing my barely touched coffee into the trash. The drive back to the lab felt shorter this time, my pulse steady but my grip tight on the wheel. When I arrived, Evelyn was waiting by the side door, her arms crossed. The expression on her face was one I had never seen before, not just concern. Something deeper. Something colder. I stepped out of the car, my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "What did you find?" She didn't answer right away. Instead she turned, pushing the door open, leading me inside. The lab was sterile, the air thick with the faint scent of chemicals and disinfectant. Evelyn walked ahead of me, her steps purposeful. She stopped by a workstation where a thin folder sat atop the counter. She picked it up and handed it to me. "Read," she said. I flipped it open. The words blurred for a moment before coming into focus. A full toxicology report. The chemical name meant nothing to me at first, just a string of letters and numbers. But the notes Evelyn had written in the margins explained everything. Sedative. Fast-acting. High potency. Dangerous in large doses. My stomach twisted. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn hesitated. Then, "Enough to knock you out within minutes." Enough to cause respiratory failure if the dose was just slightly higher. The folder felt heavier in my hands. I had known. I had suspected. But seeing it in black and white made it real. I lifted my gaze to hers. If I had drunk the whole cup? Evelyn's expression darkened. You wouldn't be standing here. I closed the folder, pressing my fingers against the cool surface. The weight of the truth settled over me, solid and immovable. Daniel had wanted me unconscious. Helpless. Or worse. And if I hadn't switched the cups. I took a slow breath, forcing my hands to remain steady. What happens now? I asked. Evelyn studied me carefully, as if trying to read the answer in my face before I even spoke it. That depends, she said. Are you going to the police? I thought about it. For exactly 3 seconds. Then I shook my head. No, I said quietly. Evelyn didn't look surprised. Then what are you going to do? I met her gaze, my voice calm. I'm going to go home. She didn't argue. She just nodded, slipping the folder back onto the counter. Be careful, Claire. I turned and walked out without another word. The storm had passed, leaving the streets slick and shining under the weak afternoon sun. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Daniel had planned for me to be dead or unconscious by now. But I was still here. Now I had proof. Which meant it was my turn to make a move. I drove home in silence. No music, no distractions. Just the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic beat of rain against the windshield. My thoughts were sharp, focused, slicing through every possible scenario, every outcome, every move I needed to make next. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my pulse was steady, my hands firm on the wheel. Daniel's car wasn't there. Good. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, letting the quiet settle around me. The house smelled like freshly brewed coffee, the same coffee that should have killed me this morning. I moved with purpose, heading straight for the kitchen. The evidence bag with the toxicology report was still in my purse. I set it down carefully on the counter, then reached for my phone. I scrolled through my messages, stopping at Daniel's name. There was a text from him sent an hour ago. Hey, heading home soon. You feeling better? I stared at the words. Feeling better. As if I had just woken up with a headache. As if this morning had been nothing more than a small inconvenience. I took a breath, then typed my reply. Much better. I'll have dinner ready when you get back. I hit send. Then I set the phone down and got to work. I moved through the kitchen methodically, pulling ingredients from the fridge, setting the table just the way Daniel liked. It had to look normal. Routine. Like I hadn't spent the entire day uncovering his plan. Like I didn't know that tonight was supposed to be my last. I checked the time. 6:47 p.m. Daniel would be home soon. I reached for the cabinet above the stove, opening it slowly, my fingers grazing the cool glass of a familiar bottle. A small container of sleeping pills, prescribed to me after a stressful period at work last year. I had never taken them. But Daniel had watched me put them away. He knew I had them. I pulled the bottle down, twisting off the cap. The pills rattled softly inside. Then with careful precision I tipped 2 into my palm and crushed them between my fingers, letting the fine powder fall into the steaming pasta sauce on the stove. I stirred slowly, watching as the powder dissolved, disappearing into the thick red liquid. By the time Daniel walked through the door at 7:12 p.m., the house smelled like dinner. Like comfort. Like home. Like nothing had changed. Hey, sweetheart, he said, dropping his keys on the counter, stepping behind me to press a kiss to my cheek. Smells amazing. I smiled. Figured I'd do something nice for you. He didn't flinch. Didn't react to the words the way I had reacted to his this morning. Because he still thought he was in control. I plated the food, setting his plate in front of him before taking my seat across the table. The candles flickered softly between us, casting warm shadows over his face. He twirled the pasta around his fork, took a bite, hummed in approval. I picked up my own fork, mirroring his movements, pretending to eat. Pretending to be normal. He chewed, swallowed. Then took another bite. And another. And then his eyelids flickered. His chewing slowed. He blinked once, twice, shaking his head slightly as if trying to clear fog from his mind. Long day? Asked, my voice soft. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. Yeah, just tired, I guess. He took another bite, but his grip on the fork was looser now. The drug was working faster than expected. He yawned, eyes drooping slightly. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. You know, I said, my voice calm, measured, I had the strangest morning. Daniel blinked at me, dazed. Yeah. I tilted my head. I almost drank something I shouldn't have. His breathing hitched. Just slightly. I watched his pupils dilate, his muscles slacken. You what? He murmured, his voice slurring just the tiniest bit. I reached into my purse, pulled out the evidence bag and set it gently on the table between us. His gaze dropped to it. His face paled. I had it tested, I said. You know what they found? His fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against the plate. His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Claire. You tried to poison me. I said it softly. Simply. Without rage. Without fear. Because for the first time Daniel was the one who should be afraid. Daniel stared at the evidence bag on the table, his breath coming in slow, uneven bursts. His fingers twitched slightly as if he wanted to grab it, to make it disappear, to erase the proof of what he had done. I didn't move. I just watched him. You tried to poison me, I repeated, my voice steady. He swallowed hard, his tongue darting out to wet his lips. Claire, he started, his voice hoarse. I don't know what you think. Don't, I cut in. The word was sharp, final. He flinched. Then he tried again, this time leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, the same hands that had prepared my coffee this morning. You're being paranoid, he said, his tone shifting. Softer now, gentler. He was trying to regain control. I would never. Stop. I tilted my head, studying him. His pupils were blown wide now. His body was beginning to betray him. The drug was taking full effect. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You should stop talking, Daniel, I said. You're not going to like what happens next. His breathing hitched. His hands tightened around the edge of the table, his knuckles white. What did you do? I smiled, slow and deliberate. That's the funny thing about trust, I murmured. You never realize it's broken until it's too late. He tried to stand, but his legs didn't fully cooperate. His chair scraped against the hardwood, and for the first time, real panic crept into his features. You, his voice slurred. I stayed seated, watching as he braced himself against the table, his chest rising and falling too quickly. What's wrong? I asked, feigning concern. His head snapped up. His breathing was labored now, sweat beading at his temples. He knew. He didn't know how, not yet. But he knew. His eyes darted to the plate of pasta in front of him, then back to me. What did you do? He asked again, his words slower this time, heavier, like they were coated in molasses. I took my time, pushing my own plate aside, folding my hands neatly in front of me. What's the dosage required for unconsciousness? I mused. I know the one for respiratory failure is a bit higher, but I was careful. Just enough to keep you awake. His body swayed slightly. You're lying, he breathed. I arched a brow. Am I? His throat worked as he swallowed, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. I saw it when the realization finally hit. I saw the exact second he understood. The coffee. The switch. He had given me a poisoned cup, and when I had reached for his instead, he had drunk it without hesitation. Daniel had poisoned himself. I watched the horror sink into his bones. His fingers trembled as he pushed away from the table, stumbling slightly, knocking over his chair in the process. This isn't what you think, he rasped, but there was no more conviction in his voice. He was unraveling. I stood slowly, moving with calm precision. What I think, I said softly, is that you planned to watch me die this morning. His breath shuddered. I stepped toward him. He stepped back. You were going to watch me drink that coffee, I continued, and then you were going to wait. He shook his head, but he didn't deny it. You would have hovered for a few minutes, acting normal, pretending nothing was wrong. Maybe you would have sat across from me just like I did tonight. Maybe you would have asked me about my day. Then when I started feeling dizzy, when my vision blurred, you would have played the concerned husband. His back hit the counter. I kept walking. You would have waited just long enough for me to pass out. And then. I smiled. You would have called 911, sounding devastated, saying you woke up and found me collapsed on the kitchen floor. His chest heaved, his body betraying him, his limbs sluggish. He was losing control. I stopped just a step away. Close enough to see the sweat glistening on his skin, the rapid rise and fall of his chest. "How close am I?" I asked. Daniel stared at me wide-eyed, cornered, drowning in his own mistakes. His lips parted, to deny, to plead, to fight. And then his knees buckled. Daniel's body hit the floor hard. His knees buckled first, then his hands, his palms slapping against the cold tile as he tried to catch himself. His breathing was ragged now, coming in uneven bursts, his fingers curling uselessly against the ground. I didn't move. I stood over him, watching the weight of his choices drag him down, the realization of what he had done consuming him whole. He had planned this. Planned to watch me drink my coffee. Planned to play the grieving husband. Planned every little detail down to the moment the paramedics would arrive. The only thing he hadn't planned for was me. His head lifted weakly, his pupils blown wide, his jaw clenched in sheer disbelief. He was searching my face for anything, remorse, regret, guilt. But there was nothing. Only quiet, cold satisfaction. His lips parted, struggling to form words, but his tongue was heavy in his mouth, his body betraying him more with each second that passed. You did this," he choked out. I crouched down, resting my elbows on my knees. "Did I?" His hands trembled as he tried to push himself up, but his muscles refused to cooperate. His body was shutting down. Not enough to kill him. Just enough to leave him helpless. Exactly the way he had wanted me. My voice was soft when I spoke again. "This morning when I almost drank that coffee, did you feel like this?" His breath hitched. "Did you feel the same panic?" I asked, tilting my head. "Did you wonder if you'd made a mistake?" A fresh wave of horror passed over his face. His head shook weakly. Not a denial. A plea. "Please," he rasped. "Call." I leaned in just enough to hear him struggle for the next word. "An ambulance?" I guessed. Daniel's throat worked, a tear slipping down the side of his face. He wasn't crying because he regretted what he had done. He was crying because he had lost. I exhaled slowly. Then finally I reached for my phone and dialed. 911, what's your emergency? I let my voice shake just a little. Just enough. My husband collapsed, I said, my tone filled with just the right amount of fear and confusion. He was fine, and then I let out a shaky breath, my eyes locked on his as he watched me play the part he had been meant to play. "Ma'am, is he breathing?" "Yes, but he's not responding. Please send someone quickly. We're dispatching an ambulance now. Stay on the line." I let the phone drop slightly from my ear, staring at him as he lay there, helpless, defeated. And then, just before the sirens broke the night air, I leaned in one last time. My lips barely moved, but he saw. "You should have been more careful, sweetheart." The front door burst open. Paramedics rushed in. Voices filled the air, loud and urgent. And I stepped back, letting fate take care of the rest.